Hey, Snickerdoodles, it's Miss Susan, and we are back to read the last two chapters of George Brown, Class Clown, Trouble Magnet. He is just getting in trouble all over the place. He's trying not to. You have to give it to him. He's trying not to. He doesn't want to get in trouble, but he is. So we're gonna finish up the book today, chapters 9 and 10. Okay. So let's get started. When we get done reading today, we are going to go ahead and fill out a graphic organizer to talk about all of those story elements that we have been looking at throughout the book. Okay, in chapter 9, let's take a look at what we think might happen in the story. Let's make a prediction by looking at the picture. I see George and Louie, the band, playing a song, it looks like. It looks like they really are playing their hearts out. And it even looks like they're starting with some lyrics here at the beginning of the chapter 9 for the words. So I'm thinking maybe they're going to play a song. Maybe they're going to perform in chapter 9. Let's get started. We're the runny noses and we're running after you. We're the runny noses, can't be stopped with no tissue. George sang the background vocals as he played his keyboard. So does that tell you which one is George? He's on the keyboard. So if you wanted to take a look over here at the picture, you can tell this must be George because he's on the keyboard. And remember earlier in the book, Louis had said he would be the lead singer, right? So that's Louis. He looked into the audience to see if he could spot his parents. There were a lot of people out there, but it was always easy to find his dad. An army uniform really stood out in a crowd. Coming to you as hard as a sneeze. We'll play just as long as we please. The lyrics were pretty dumb. Louis had written them, and Mike and Max kept saying how cool the song was. So those were the words they used. George tried to play in time with Mike's drums. It wasn't easy. Every now and then, Mike would speed up or slow down, but then again, George didn't always play the right notes. And Louis had forgotten a couple of words in the first verse, but no one seemed to notice. In fact, some people were clapping along. George was starting to have a good time. Then suddenly, he got a strange feeling in his stomach. A bunch of bubbles were suddenly bouncing up and down and all around in his belly. Oh no, not again. George had to stop that burp right now, but this time he couldn't use his hands to beat down the burp. He had to keep playing. So he just held his breath until his face turned red. Louis turned around to face George. What are you doing? He whispered angrily. George didn't answer. He couldn't. The bubbles ping pong pinged their way up out of George's stomach. They boing bing boinged their way to his chest. They bing boing binged their way up his throat, and then burp. George let out the loudest burp in the history of Edith B. Sugarman Elementary School. In fact, if burping counted as a talent, George could have walked away with a trophy, the super duper mega burping trophy. The audience laughed really hard. Louis and Mike just stared at him. It wasn't me, George said. The words slipped right out of George's mouth. He hadn't meant to say them. The audience just laughed harder, and then George's feet got a great idea. They slipped right out of their shoes and wriggled out of his socks. Then his feet propped themselves up on the keyboard. George tried to stop them. He tried to slap them down from the piano. Stop, he ordered, but George's feet would not obey. His toes wanted to play the keyboard. Go tell Aunt Rhody, go tell Aunt Rhody. What are you playing? Louis asked. That's for kindergarteners. But it was the only song George's toes knew, so they kept playing it. Go tell Aunt Rhody, go tell Aunt Rhody, go tell Aunt Rhody the old gray goose is dead. Cut it out, Louis shouted. George turned and smiled at the audience. He stood up and took a bow. The kids all cheered wildly. And then, before George even knew what was happening, dive bomb! George shouted as he took a flying leap off the stage. Wahoo! George was soaring in the air and headed right for the crowd. A bunch of older kids, one of them was Louis's brother, reached up. Two kids caught his legs. Someone's dad caught him right in the armpits. His head fell into someone's arms. The crowd cheered wildly. George, George, George. Just then, George felt something burst in his body. Whoosh! All the air rushed right out of him. The super burp was gone, but George was still there. As he looked up, he realized Mrs. McKeon was holding his head, and she did not look happy. Uh-oh. George had just dive bombed into the principal. This was bad. All right, so he's in trouble from that burp. Let's see what happens. It looks like these guys look like they're upset, don't they? What do you think is happening? Maybe. Let's find out. I can't believe we didn't even come in third, Mike complained as he packed up his drumsticks after the talent show. Are you kidding? Louis asked. After what he did, we're lucky we didn't get thrown out of school. George looked down at the ground. He felt really bad. Louis had wanted a trophy. They all did. And maybe they would have gotten one except for the stupid super burp. We never should have let you in the band, Louis told George. You messed the whole thing up. If I was Mrs. McKeon, I'd take away your recess for a whole year. George couldn't imagine what Louis would be like as a principal of a school. It was too scary to think about. You're going to be sorry you did this to me. I mean, to us, Louis said. You're out of the band. Just then, Sam and two other middle school kids came backstage. They were heading toward the band. Uh-oh. The last thing George wanted now was some older kids making fun of him. Louis looked kind of nervous as his brother walked closer and closer. You guys were good, Sam said. Really, Sam? You really thought? Louis said. Sam didn't answer. Instead, he was looking at George. And you are amazing, dude, he told George. Playing keyboard with your toes, Sam's friend added. How do you do that? The dive bomb was the best part, Sam said. You guys were ripped off. The third middle schooler told him. You should have won. George just stood there, surprised. He wasn't sure what to say. That dive bomb was my idea, Louis told Sam. I would have done it myself, but I didn't want to break my guitar. George shook his head. Louis was unbelievable. At our next concert, I'm going to dive bomb, Louis told George. Huh? Their next concert? What next concert? Hadn't Louis just thrown him out of the band? Just then, Alex came over. My mom said you and your parents should come for ice cream with us, he said to George. We're going to Ernie's Ice Cream Emporium. Ernie's. That was the last place George wanted to go tonight. That was where it had all started. It was the scene of the first bump. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread. Let me reread. That's what good readers do. It was the scene of the first burp. And George had had enough burping for one night. I better not, George told Alex. My parents will be waiting for me out in the hall. I have a feeling they're not going to want me to go anywhere. They're probably going to want to talk. Alex nodded and then shook his head sadly. When parents wanted to talk, it was never a good thing. Well, let's hang out tomorrow if you're allowed, Alex told him. I'm still working on how to ollie. Louis shook his head. George can't skateboard tomorrow. He's got band practice. Sorry, Louis, it's not happening, George told him. I'm hanging out with Alex tomorrow. Louis stared at George like he couldn't believe anyone would turn down a chance to hang out with him. We can rehearse on Sunday, though, George said. Louis didn't look happy, but all he said was, okay, Sunday, cool. Suddenly, George heard a loud, rumbly noise. It was coming from his stomach. Everyone just stopped and stared. Dude, gross, the fifth grader said. A familiar feeling came over George. He put his hand on his stomach, and then he smiled. There was no burp in there. In fact, there was nothing in there. His stomach was just empty. I'm starving. My stomach always grumbles when I'm hungry, George explained. George was happy to be burp free, at least for now. But somehow he had a feeling the super burp would come back. He just didn't know when or what it would make him do. The only thing he knew for sure was that when that burp came back, it was going to cause trouble. And that was just plain bad. The end. All right, now by a show of fingers, how did you like that story? One, it was okay. I didn't really care for it too much. Or three, it was pretty good. Or five, that was a really cool story and I would recommend it to a friend. So show me your numbers. What would you give it? 5 stars for that book? 4, 3, 2, not very good. 1, bad book, didn't really like it. It's okay. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. So whether you liked it and gave it 5 stars or didn't really like it and only gave it 1, that's okay. I hope that you enjoyed that reading that book with us. And we are going to fill out some information about that book. So let's get started. I have a sheet printed out here, and it's got all of our story elements on it that we have been talking about. And this is very easy for you to fill out if you want to. You can print this from something like this from the internet, or you can just draw it in your notebook. So what we have here is the title says fiction story elements. And of course, just like your favorite cookies have certain ingredients, stories that like the one we read have certain ingredients too that make up the whole thing, right? So in order to get your chocolate chip cookies, you need sugar and flour and chocolate chips, all of that good stuff, right? You have to have those to make up the whole cookie. Well, to get a good story, you have to have certain things too. And these are the 5 elements we've been talking about in our videos for this book. So we have characters. We talked about all the characters, the setting, plot, conflict, and theme. And together, all 5 of these things make up a good story. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to fill out the definition for each one of these things, and we're going to fill out some signal words that we might see that will indicate to us in the story that that's what that is. And we have a nice little picture to help us remember what that word is and what it means for the next time we read a story. So what did we say characters are? Do you remember us talking about the characters? Write that down on your page if you can. Feel free to pause the video and draw this out on your paper if you would like to, or you can print it from the internet if you'd like. And when you're ready, go ahead and click play again. All right, so let's take care of filling in the definition for the word characters. What did we say the characters are in the story? Did you get the people and the animals? People and animals. Try your best to spell it correctly, okay? Now, when we see signal words in a story for characters, we might see pronouns like he and she and they, or we might see names. Names like in our story, it was George, Alex, Louis, Mrs. Kelly was a character in our story. Those were some characters in our story. The main character is usually the most important character. And in our story, who was the main character? George, right. George was our main character. He was the most important. He was the one character that was just always, he was in every chapter, he was on every page. He was the one that the whole story was about. Even the book is titled after him. George Brown. So George Brown was our main character. That's what we call our main character. All right, what was the setting? Do you remember what a setting is? If I said, what is the setting of that story? What does that mean? I, I can think of two words: time and place. Did you get those? Awesome. All right, so when we see signal words in our story that tell us that it's telling us where the setting is or where the story is taking place or what time it is, you might see maybe a time of day, like an actual time that you might see on the clock, like here on this clock, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He woke up early at 6 a.m. 6 a.m. would be the time. Or you could hear or read a time of day. So it might be morning, afternoon, nighttime, or during the day, something like that. You might hear a word that describes what time of day, what section of the day you're in. You might also hear the name of places. So you might hear maybe a city name. You might see New York, New York, right? And that's a location, that's a place here in the United States, and it's somewhere on the earth. You might see a type of building that they're writing to us about, like a school, like in our story. They were at a school, right? Or they could be at a place like a park or even an amusement park with roller coasters. That sounds fun. So the setting for our story today for Trouble Magnet was during the day, in the afternoon usually, and at school, right? They were at school most of the time. Where else were they? They were at someone's house. They were at Louie's house. All right. How about the plot? Now, the plot is something that you might spend a lot of time on. You could talk about what happened in each chapter. So you could say we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10. We have 10 chapters. You could name one thing in each chapter that happened because the plot is the events in the story. In the signal words, you might see in the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, or you might see the end. You might see signal words like first, then, next, or last. When you see those words in a story, they're telling you something's happening. First, this happened. That's an event in the story. Second, this happened. You might see a numerical number, an order number, first, second, or third. Or you might see first, then, next, and last. And so that tells you things are happening in the story. Actions or verbs are happening in the story. At the beginning of a story, you have what we call an exposition, which is just the introduction, the information about the characters. It tells you the setting. It tells you what's been going on before the story started, maybe. And then you're going to have some rising action, some things that go leading up to the main event. And the main event we call the climax. And that's the biggest thing that happens in the story. That's going to be the most important thing. It's the turning point in the story. And after that big event, you're going to have some falling action or ending action. And that's just some more things that might end in the story. And then at the end of the story, you have what we call a denouement, and that's a French word. You don't have to know that. You can just say the end. That's okay. But the end is just kind of the solution. How did they solve the conflict in the story? What happened in the story that kind of tied it all up in the end? And how how did it end in the end for the characters? You know, what happened to the characters? Now the conflict in the story is what? Do you remember what our conflict is? We need the definition of it now for this column. The conflict is the problem or what went wrong. And some words that we might see that tells you that something is a conflict. Let's see. You might actually see the word problem. The author might come out right out and tell you the problem was that the volcano erupted all over the classroom. That was a problem in the story, wasn't it? Or, like in our story, they might not tell you it's a conflict. They might not tell you it's a problem. But as you're reading and you're gathering clues and you're thinking about the story as good readers do, you make an inference. And an inference is taking what you know in your head and your brain and what you read in the book. And you put them together and you go, that might be what's happening, you know? So you can make an inference about a conflict. So we knew that one of the characters was worried about going on stage, and they told him to picture the audience in their pajamas or underwear, and that would help him, that would relax him, you know. And they said take a deep breath. And so we can, from all of those actions, from what that character was doing and feeling to what the other characters were trying to help him with, we can tell that he was afraid of going on stage. He had stage fright, right? It never came right out and told us that, but he did. And so you can put the details of the story together to make an inference. So I'm going to say use details to make an inference. So the details, though, are the signal words for that part of this chart that we're filling out, this graphic organizer that we're filling out. You might see the word because. He got grounded because he was rude to his parents, you know? So that because tells you that a cause is coming up, and that is kind of like a conflict, okay? So that can tell you what the conflict in the story might be. All right, and then here we have a picture of just, you know, somebody standing in the middle. He might be a mediator, and then this person is kind of arguing against that person. So that's kind of a way that you can remember conflict. A conflict is kind of like a fight, hopefully not a physical fight. We didn't have any physical fights, luckily, in our book. But it's when, you know, a conflict is, it could be, you know, you and a friend, or it could be maybe one thought you have, like, I should eat this whole container of ice cream. And another thought you have, like, that's not healthy. I shouldn't do that. And maybe you're in the middle trying to decide which one to go with, right? So it could be yourself versus yourself, or it could be you versus a friend, anything like that. It could be you versus nature. Maybe you're in your house and there is a tornado coming, right? And that would be nature, right? That would be a problem with nature. All right, let's take a look at the theme of our book. What does theme mean? Do you remember? What would you write in this box? It's the big idea. Yeah, if you said big idea, kiss your brain. Good job. So it's the big idea. It's what the author wants us to learn. What the author wants us to learn from the story. Kind of what they want us to take away from the story. And, well, the signal words here. There might not be any signal words for the theme. A theme is where you definitely, remember we said you use details to make an inference for the conflict. You definitely have to make an inference. Or, oops, I spelled it wrong. Good writers go back and correct when they can. Inference. So for a theme, you definitely have to make an inference. So in order to figure out what the author wants us to know or the big idea of the story, we have to think back what happened in the story. Think about the events of the story. And if you know all of these things that are in the story, the characters, the setting, the plot, and the conflict, you can probably make an educated guess and come up with an inference of what the author wants us to learn. What do you think we should learn from our story that we read here today? Maybe be a good student. What do you think we should learn from our story? What do you think Nancy Krulik wanted us to learn by reading this story? George wanted to be a good student, right? Let's talk about the plot. First, he was a new student, right? George was a new student. In the beginning, he was a new student. And at his old school, he got in a lot of trouble, and he didn't want to do that. So he was trying really, really hard to be good, wasn't he? But then he kept having all these burps, right? And then he had the big burp at the end in the talent show. And then he had all these things happen at the end of the story. He ended up being friends with Alex anyway, being friends with all of them anyway. And he was able to stay in the band, right? All those good things happened towards the end of the story. And at the end, he said, well, I'm still going to have these burps, but I'm going to do my best to try to keep them down. So the theme of the story, what can we get from that? Let's see. He had super burps that made George do silly things. That was his conflict. Let's see here. He had these super burps. They made him do silly things. Yeah, that was the conflict. So think about the theme. What could we learn from that? Try to be a good student, maybe. Maybe try to be a good student. Follow the rules as much as you can anyway. Follow the rules, be a good friend, because there were lots of examples of when George and Alex could have kind of gotten into an argument or got upset with each other, but they didn't. They talked it out and they were good friends to each other. They were accepting of each other. And so they stayed friends in the end. So maybe the theme that Nancy Krulik wants us to get from this is be a good friend. So you might come up with another idea for the theme. When readers and writers talk about a theme, they can have differing opinions, and that's okay. I might think one thing, and you might think another. Maybe you got something different out of this book, and that's perfectly fine. All right. All right. Well, that is the rest of the book. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope you have fun. Maybe if you liked George Brown Class Clown, Trouble Magnet, you can go to your library and check out another book in the series by Nancy Krulik. Thank you for joining us to read these 10 chapters. We had a good time together, I think. I hope that you liked these videos. If so, like them all, subscribe to the channel so that you'll know when we have more videos available. Thank you for spending your time with us. Take care of you.